Everybody in the world really thought Carroll Shelby had 6 Cobras. He didn't. He only had 1. It had a flowing body, very smooth, lots of neat curves in it, very appealing, very good looking. 4-wheel independent suspension, wire wheels. Had all the neat ingredients that you wanted in a sports car in that era.
Imagine discovering a car so rare that experts believed it had been destroyed more than 50 years ago. A one-of-one Shelby prototype.
One of one, it's actually serial number 1, 2011 Shelby GTS concept.
Built to test the future of the Mustang, vanished without a trace, and slowly became an automotive legend. Then, one forgotten VIN changed everything. Hidden in a dusty Texas field was a machine that rewrote Shelby history and shocked collectors around the world. But how did one of the most important Mustangs ever built disappear for half a century? And why was it mistaken for an ordinary junk car? In this video, we'll uncover the mystery, the search, and the incredible resurrection of Shelby's legendary Little Red. The Shelby mystery begins. Before Carroll Shelby became a name stitched into American performance history, he was a Texas-born racer who understood one thing better than almost anyone else in the business: that a car was never truly finished, only paused between versions of itself. By the late 1950s, he had already won at Le Mans.
When we won Le Mans in '66, we started engines that had a Le Mans, engine and gearbox that had a Le Mans.
Sharing the victory with Roy Salvadori, before a heart condition forced him out of the cockpit for good. He did not stop building. He simply moved from the driver's seat to the workbench, and from the workbench, he began asking Ford a question the company was not fully prepared to answer. How far could a Mustang actually go if nobody worried about how it would look on a dealership brochure? By the time the Mustang partnership began, Shelby had already given Ford something money alone could not buy: credibility on a track where Ferrari had spent years looking untouchable. That standing bought him a kind of freedom most outside contractors never received: room to experiment on Ford's own product line without every decision passing through a committee first. It is one thing to be handed a factory car and asked to make it faster. It is another thing entirely to be handed the freedom to ask whether the car itself was still asking the right questions. That freedom is what made a car like Little Red possible in the first place. A Shelby-built experiment, sitting inside a Ford program rather than off in some independent workshop. Most people who know the Shelby name picture the cars that reached a showroom floor: the GT350, the GT500, the Cobra before it.
When you look at what I call the real McCoy of a Cobra, there's the real McCoy right there. Every knockoff in the world has taken this car as its mark, really.
Those cars were the finished argument, polished, and ready for a customer to sign for. But a finished argument needs drafts first, and Shelby American's real laboratory work rarely made it past a test track or a Ford proving ground. Prototype vehicles in the 1960s were treated as tools, not treasures. They carried no sentimental value to the people who built them, because nobody involved was thinking about auction houses 40 years down the road. Why would anyone bother preserving a car they expected to outlive its usefulness within a single season? They were thinking about deadlines, about racing results, about whether a supercharger bolted onto a big block engine could survive an entire season without failing under stress. Suspension geometry got reworked overnight between test sessions. Body panels got reshaped between weekends based on notes scrawled in a mechanic's own hand. A test mule earned its keep by breaking in ways a customer's car never could, because every failure taught engineers something the drafting table alone never would. Once a prototype had answered its question, it had no obvious reason to keep existing at all. Little Red was one of those questions given a body. Built as a 1967 Shelby GT500 EXP,
This is a 1967 GT500 coupe, the only one ever built.
It broke from the familiar shape almost immediately. Where production Shelbys wore a fastback silhouette, Little Red was a notchback coupe, a body-style Shelby American, almost never touched in its regular lineup. It remains the only GT500 coupe the company ever built, and the only GT500 factory-equipped with dual-quad carburetors, a detail that alone would separate it from every other car wearing the same badge. What kind of car earns a distinction like that without ever being sold to a single customer? Underneath its skin, engineers cycled through more than one engine configuration over its working life, including a supercharged big block setup.
Well, it has 2 superchargers under the hood.
Fed through a Paxton supercharger, testing combinations that had no guarantee of ever reaching a paying customer at all. Why would anyone build something so deliberately temporary, so clearly designed to be outgrown before it was even finished? Because that instability was the entire point. Little Red existed to be pushed, altered, and eventually discarded, not admired from behind a velvet rope in a climate-controlled showroom. That is precisely what should have made its survival impossible. A car with no production run, no dealer paperwork trail in the way an ordinary Mustang would have, and no sentimental protection from the people who actually built it, had every structural reason to disappear the moment its usefulness ran out. Corporate liability, obsolete engineering, experimental parts nobody wanted documented for warranty reasons, all of it pushed toward quiet disposal rather than preservation. Against pressure like that, what real chance did a car like Little Red actually have? Shelby American itself was a small, improvisational operation compared to the corporate engineering departments around it, and small operations rarely keep detailed records of the cars they intend to throw away. And for the better part of 5 decades, everyone who cared about Shelby history believed that was exactly what had happened to Little Red. Not hidden away somewhere waiting patiently to be found. Simply gone, the way test mules were supposed to go, with nothing left behind but a name in old paperwork and a handful of grainy photographs passed between collectors.
Little Red, a 1967 Shelby Mustang prototype. It was once believed that it was destroyed and lost forever.
The mystery of the 2 lost prototypes. Little Red was not built alone. A year after its creation, Shelby American produced a second experimental notchback, a 1968 GT500 EXP, that would come to be known as the Green Hornet. Where Little Red carried Shelby's big block and supercharging experiments, the Green Hornet pushed in a different direction: independent rear suspension, 4-wheel disc brakes, and an early attempt at electronic fuel injection, features that would not become common on performance Mustangs for decades. What gave Ford and Shelby the confidence to test ideas that far ahead of their own line? The Green Hornet was just as far ahead of its time as its sibling, rehearsing a future the Mustang lineup had not yet earned the right to build. Unlike Little Red, the Green Hornet never fully vanished from public memory, though for years it lived mostly as rumor, the kind of story collectors traded without expecting it confirmed. It surfaced at auction in 2013, drawing a bid of $1,800,000, only to fall short of its reserve and go unsold. How many near misses had simply been forgotten before anyone wrote them down? Collector car chairman Craig Jackson eventually acquired it, and when he and restoration specialist Jason Billups began digging into its history, an old question resurfaced. If one notchback had survived, was its sibling mistaken for an ordinary car by whoever held its title? It was not an easy question to take seriously. Little Red had been searched for, on and off, for decades, by Shelby historians and researchers connected to the Shelby American Automobile Club, tracking Shelby history since 1975, and by collectors who had filed the car away as folklore rather than an object waiting to be found. Haggerty, the collector car publication, would later describe both notchbacks as urban legends, a fitting label for a car so mythologized that even researchers treated its existence as a story rather than a fact. At what point does a rumor start getting treated as settled history? The working theory, repeated so often it calcified into certainty, was that the car had been destroyed quietly, without documentation, the moment its purpose had been served. There was simply an absence, and for 50 years, that absence had been mistaken for an answer. Billups was not entirely convinced. The Green Hornet's own survival was proof the 1960s treated prototypes with more inconsistency than folklore admitted. Some crushed as planned, some sold off unrecorded, some slipped into private hands with their history stripped away entirely. If a car this loaded could sit outside public knowledge for years, what made anyone certain Little Red had met the fate everyone kept repeating as fact? That flicker of doubt was enough to reopen a search treated as closed for longer than most of the people conducting it had been alive. For decades, progress meant only a magazine mention, a half-remembered sighting, fragments that never added up, every lead dissolving into speculation, exactly how a car becomes legend. The VIN that solved a 50-year mystery. Here is where the mystery of Little Red stopped being a matter of belief and became a matter of method. Because for decades, the people looking for it had been chasing the wrong identity entirely. Every Shelby Mustang carried two separate sets of numbers. One was the Shelby-assigned serial number, stamped onto a plate riveted into the car once it left Ford's assembly line and entered Shelby American's build process, numbered in its own sequence that ran independently of anything Ford itself used. The other was the original Ford vehicle identification number.
So I was looking for a particular Mustang coupe, the VIN number 133947. I could see that in '94 you owned this car, was wondering if you still had it.
Stamped into the car before Shelby ever touched it at all, assigned consecutively on Ford's own production line, mixed in among ordinary Mustangs, Falcons, and Fairlanes built at the very same plant. Which of those two numbers, then, actually told the truth about where a car had been? For ordinary collector research, the Shelby serial number was usually more than enough to trace a car's entire history from build sheet to current owner. For Little Red, that same number was a dead end that had swallowed every previous search attempt without exception, year after year. Complicating matters further, Shelby cars from that era never received the standard door data plates found on ordinary Fords. Holes were simply drilled where those plates would normally sit, meaning one of the usual verification points collectors relied on was missing from these cars entirely. Anyone searching by the book was working with an incomplete toolkit before they even began. Billups and Jackson made the decision to abandon that familiar approach entirely and trace the car through its original Ford VIN instead, a number that was, by design, far less discoverable, buried under decades of ownership changes and incomplete dealership paperwork. It was a slower path, and a far less obvious one, but it was the only path that had not already failed everyone who tried it before. Why had nobody thought to search this way sooner, given how long the car had already been missing? Perhaps because the Shelby identity was the famous one, the one worth chasing on a plaque, while the underlying Ford VIN felt like a bureaucratic footnote beneath a legend. That assumption, it turned out, was exactly backward, and correcting it meant starting the entire search over from a completely different set of records than anyone had used before. The Ford VIN trail eventually surfaced a registration history, and that history pointed toward an owner who had held the car for more than 2 decades without any apparent awareness of what it actually was. The investigation was never a solo effort. Restoration specialist Jason Billups led the search. working alongside automotive journalist Al Rogers and Ford Mustang and Shelby specialist Todd Holler, piecing together fragments of documentation that had sat unexamined in filing cabinets and old registries for years, cross-checking dealership records against decades-old title transfers, one entry at a time. Initial contact with the property's owner came quietly, through social media outreach, part of a chain of leads that could easily have gone nowhere at any point along the way. Would a stranger's message even get a reply after 50 years of silence? A meeting was eventually arranged in Dallas, Texas, to confirm in person what the paperwork seemed to already be suggesting on its own. Even with a promising lead in hand, nothing about Little Red could be treated as certain until the car itself was examined and matched, number by number, against its own recorded history. Ford Mustang authentication expert Kevin Marty, whose name carries particular weight in Shelby verification circles, would ultimately help confirm what the VIN trail had pointed toward from the very start. But could a name on a database entry really settle something this significant on its own? That confirmation required something the paper trail alone could never provide. It required standing in front of the actual car, on the actual property, where it had sat largely unnoticed for the better part of 20 years, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question about it. One VIN changed automotive history. On March 3, 2018, Jason Billups, Al Rogers, and Todd Holler were finally given access to the rural North Texas property the VIN trail had led them to. What they found did not look like a legend. It looked like a tired Mustang shell sitting among other aging vehicles, stripped of its engine and transmission, its body worn down by 2 decades of exposure and quiet neglect. There was no dramatic reveal beneath a dust sheet, no hidden garage lit for effect. There was only a car that, to anyone unfamiliar with its history, would have been easy to walk straight past without a second glance. 20 years of Texas weather had done what 20 years of weather does to any abandoned steel body, fading the red paint, working rust into seams that had once been sealed tight on a factory line, leaving a shape that was recognizable only to someone who already knew exactly what they were looking for. How many people had driven past that same field over the years without ever slowing down? That, in its own way, was exactly how Little Red had managed to survive. A prototype without a well-known production identity is vulnerable in a very specific way. If the person holding it does not know what they actually have, there is nothing stopping it from being parted out for scrap, cleared to make room for something else, or simply left to rot into unrecognizability over time. The car had passed through hands that had no particular reason to treat it as anything more than an old, unusual Mustang taking up space on a property, including a Colorado dealership that once sold it along without any mention of where it had actually come from. Had it looked more obviously significant at any point along the way, would it have survived at all, or would its rarity have simply made it a target instead of an afterthought? Its own ordinariness, strange as it sounds, may have been the very thing that kept it intact for so long, hidden not by a vault, but by low expectations. Authentication followed the discovery methodically, not instantly. Genuine Shelby verification typically requires matching numbers across several separate locations on a single car: the underlying Ford VIN, the inner fender stamping, and the engine block pad, all needing to agree with one another before a claim can be trusted. What happens to a discovery like this if even one of those numbers refuses to match? The Ford VIN on Little Red was cross-referenced against the physical vehicle itself, panel by panel, and Kevin Marty's expertise helped verify the identity the paperwork trail had already suggested weeks earlier. What had been treated as little more than automotive folklore for decades was, number by number, confirmed as documented fact. The find was made public later that year, when Barrett Jackson chairman and chief executive Craig Jackson announced the discovery during the Woodward Dream Cruise in Michigan, one of the largest gatherings of car enthusiasts in the country, with the car subsequently put on display at the Henry Ford Museum for the public to see for the first time in decades. For a hobby built on the idea that most of its major discoveries had already happened, watching a car step out of pure rumor and into a museum case in real time was not something collectors expected to witness in their own lifetime. Jackson's own words captured what the moment meant to the small community that had spent decades chasing a rumor most had quietly given up on entirely. Finding Little Red is the discovery of a lifetime. The announcement did far more than simply close a decades-old search. It forced a correction to the accepted record of Shelby history, one built not on a lucky glance into a barn, but on a deliberate decision to stop trusting an assumption that had gone unquestioned for far too long. In a hobby that prides itself on precise documentation above almost everything else. How often does any hobby get the chance to rewrite its own record books in real time? The resurrection of Little Red discovery was only the beginning of a harder question. What does a team actually owe a car like Little Red once it has finally been found? Some voices in the collector world argue that a lost prototype should be preserved exactly as it was recovered, rust, missing parts and all, because every flaw stands as physical evidence of survival itself. Others argue that a car built to be driven, tested and pushed has no business sitting frozen and silent under museum lighting for the rest of its existence. Which version of respect actually honors what a car like this was built to do? Jackson and his team ultimately chose restoration, working to return Little Red to the form it held when its experimental work actually mattered most, rebuilding it around its supercharged big block heritage and its distinctive notchback body, a project that stretched on for close to 2 years before it was ready to be shown. Because the car had been modified more than once during its working life, with no single production specification to fall back on, the restoration team had to decide which version of Little Red they were actually bringing back. An experimental car, frozen at a moment in its own evolution, rather than a fixed factory design anyone could simply photocopy from an old build sheet. That restoration carried weight beyond the car itself, because Little Red's influence had already reached the public in a way most people never fully realized. Its styling directly shaped the 1968 Mustang California Special, meaning the ideas tested on this one experimental coupe had quietly traveled into a production model long before the source car was ever found again. Collectors had been looking at echoes of Little Red for years without knowing the original still existed somewhere out there. Was that connection obvious to anyone at the time it actually happened, or did it only become visible in hindsight, once the missing piece was finally back in the picture where it belonged? The fully restored car was unveiled to the public on January 16, 2020, at the Barrett Jackson auction in Scottsdale, Arizona. Standing beside it that morning was the Green Hornet, the sibling prototype whose own restoration had reopened the search for Little Red in the first place. It marked the first time in history the two experimental notchbacks had ever been displayed together in public, in front of Barrett Jackson President Steve Davis, Ford Mustang brand manager Jim Owens, and Carroll Shelby's own grandson, Aaron Shelby. Their story was later told across 2 documentary films, narrated by Aaron Shelby himself, and broadcast on national television, carrying both cars to an audience neither had ever reached during its working life on a test track. Would either car still exist to tell that story if one search had gone even slightly differently? For Aaron Shelby, standing beside 2 cars his grandfather had built to be temporary, the moment carried a weight that had nothing to do with market value. These were not the polished productions Shelby's most fans had grown up admiring in magazines. They were the rough drafts, the arguments Carroll Shelby had been having with himself about what a Mustang could still become. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, both drafts had survived long enough to be read. The significance of that pairing went well beyond spectacle. Little Red and the Green Hornet represent two branches of the same experimental culture. Two separate attempts to discover what a Mustang could actually become before caution, budgets, and production schedules were ever allowed to weigh in on the answer. Their survival, against every reasonable expectation either car had of surviving at all, stands as a lasting reminder that automotive history is never as fully settled as it appears from the outside looking in. There are still records that have not surfaced, ownership chains that have never been fully traced, and cars sitting quietly in fields and garages tonight that may be far more significant than anyone currently realizes. How many of them are still waiting for someone to ask the right question? Little Red survived not because someone got lucky, but because two men refused to trust a search that had failed everyone before them. A car, once written off as scrap, turned out to be one of the most important Mustangs Shelby ever built, hiding in plain sight the entire time. It took 50 years, one overlooked VIN, and a team willing to question a legend everyone accepted as fact. So here's the question. If a car this significant could vanish for half a century, what else is out there, waiting to be found? Let us know in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more hidden chapters of automotive history.